just wanted to put this stole on before I preach because, as you can see, it was made for me by a children's church school. The thing you don't see is the colour of the hands that made it. As we observe Martin Luther King Day today, our readings instantly remind us of the curse that has been afflicted in the human race for thousands of years. It's a curse that causes one group of people to believe that they are more superior and more deserving than other groups, which are different in some way, and therefore less deserving of their human rights and opportunities. The difference may be the colour of the other group's skin, the way in which they worship God, the language they speak, the way in which they live their lives. Even the difference of being born a woman instead of a man can all determine the human rights that you will have access to in living your life, just as we have recently seen magnified in Afghanistan and Iran. In today's Old Testament reading from Exodus, we read about the plight of the Israelites some 4,000 years ago. At first, they were welcomed as guests into Egypt, after which they began to play an increasing role in the political and economic life of the country. Increasingly, however, their success was seen with jealousy by the native Egyptians. And when a new Pharaoh came to the throne, one who saw the Israelites as different and less deserving than his own people, he chose to have them enslaved. They suffered for over 400 years before God sent the 10 plagues upon Egypt, after which Moses was able to lead them out of Egypt towards the land that the Bible tells us God had promised that they could live in. After Moses died on Mount Nebo, we read that Joshua led the Israelites across the River Jordan to live in that promised land, but then proceeded to destroy city after city. This was done to drive the native populations of Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, and many others out of their lands, and for the Israelites to claim all the lands west of the Jordan as theirs, and theirs alone. The Bible infers that it was God's will that Joshua destroyed all these other nations to take possession of the land, and yet, surely, isn't this the same God who tells us we are to seek justice, to share our blessings, and to love our neighbours as ourselves? To my mind, this calls into question whether that same curse which causes humankind to justify our actions against those who are different or who possess what we want to possess may also have been influencing Joshua as he led his armies on a path of destruction rather than sharing the land with his neighbours. It's difficult not to draw a comparison between the slavery and killing of millions of Jews in Nazi Germany and what's happening today in the Promised Land with the persecution and driving out of Palestinians from their ancestral lands. Perhaps the curse of feeling superior and justified in taking away another's rights and possessions can be traded back and forth depending on which side of the equation you happen to find yourself. Certainly in today's gospel reading from Luke, we hear Jesus telling a large crowd who'd gathered alongside his disciples how they should start behaving in order to overcome this curse on humanity. He says we are to love our neighbours, to do good to those who hate you, to bless those who curse you, and to pray for those who mistreat you. If anyone strikes us on the cheek, we are to offer the other. And Jesus continues in this vein of how to be non-violent while striving to build harmony until he finally comes to what we now call the golden rule. To do to others as you would have them do to you. Imagine, as John Lennon would have said, if we all lived by that one rule, there'd be no racism, no segregation, greed or discrimination that was aimed at those who look, sound, or live their lives differently from our own. You know, you'll sometimes hear people say that religion is to blame for much of it, that is the root cause of all this discrimination, division, and hatred between people throughout the world. And yet, just look. It shows on this poster that literally every major religion in the world proclaims that the Golden Rule is at the core of its beliefs. As an ordained Baptist minister and a member of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Martin Luther King Jr. embraced the Golden Rule by being inspired by Christ's teachings about non-violent resistance and activism. King Jr. was born in 1929, and he was raised in Atlanta, Georgia, where racial segregation was actually entrenched in law. The name Luther was actually added to the family name after his father, King Sr., returned from a trip from Germany in the 1930s. He was appalled after seeing the rise of the Nazi Party, but he was also motivated after visiting the sites associated with the struggles of the German reformist leader, Martin Luther. So he returned and added Luther to the family name. As a young boy, Martin Luther King Jr. was friends with a white boy who lived just across the street. But at the age of 6 years old, they both started school, with King going to an all-black school and his friend going to a whites-only school. Thereafter, the white family stopped their son from playing with King anymore because he was black. And when the young boy, King, told his parents, they decided it was time for him to learn about the history of slavery and racism in America. And after hearing about the hatred and the violence and the oppression that African Americans faced every day, the 6-year-old King said from that point on, he would start hating every white person. However, his Christian parents stepped in immediately and gave him a powerful life lesson and told him to stop that thinking immediately, because it was his Christian duty to love everyone as Jesus had proclaimed. The family attended Ebenezer Baptist Church, where King Sr. was the pastor, and he himself was an outspoken advocate for civil rights. And in 1936, he had led hundreds of African Americans in a march to Atlanta City Hall to protest against voting rights discriminations against African Americans. This clearly helped shape King Jr., who gave his first civil rights speech in high school at the age of 15. Coincidentally, it was also the same year that he sat his entrance exams for university and was accepted into the racially integrated northern city of Connecticut, where he attended university and experienced the first time people of all races sharing the seats on buses and in restaurants and in church. By the age of 19, King Jr. had enrolled in seminary. And after gaining his doctorate, he married Coretta Scott, another activist. That was in 1953. In 1954, at the age of 25, he was appointed pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church back in the segregated South, in Montgomery, Alabama. It was there in the same year that Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus for a white person, triggering the Montgomery bus boycott that led to bus segregation eventually being deemed to have violated the United States Constitution. From 1955 until his assassination in 1968, Dr. King became the most prominent leader and spokesperson of the United States civil rights movement. In 1959, he returned to Atlanta as pastor of his father's church, Ebenezer Baptist Church. Always beginning with prayer and quoting the example of India's Mahatma Gandhi, he continued to lead non-violent marches against the Jim Crow racial segregation laws. These marches included Birmingham, Alabama, the March on Washington in 1963, and in 1965, Dr. King helped to organize what was meant to be a non-violent march from Selma to Montgomery to protest against restricted voting rights for African Americans in Alabama. The non-violent, unarmed marchers were violently attacked by state troopers after crossing the county line in what became known as Bloody Sunday. Another attempt was made 2 days later, but when the marchers once again came face to face with state troopers and police at the bridge marking the county line, Dr. King, he chose to turn the crowd around. And he led them back instead to his church to pray. It was President Johnson eventually who ordered the National Guard to protect the next march. And 2 weeks later, under the protection of 1,900 National Guard officers and numerous FBI agents and federal marshals, 25,000 unarmed, non-violent protesters succeeded in marching peacefully to the state capitol to protest for their voting rights. Dr. King's well remembered for his powerful speeches against racism and segregation, not least his memorable 1964 speech, I Have a Dream, that he gave in Washington, D.C., in which he dreamed that one day little black boys and black girls would be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I just draw this lovely little canvas painting that Michelle drew, painted, to demonstrate and display that concept of black and white holding their hands together as brothers and sisters. That same year, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for leading non-violent resistance to racial prejudice. And throughout his life, he received over 50 honorary university degrees. However, it's important for us to remember that he didn't just campaign for the rights of African Americans. As a faithful Christian, Dr. King's passion for civil rights and justice was far broader than that. He also campaigned against the Vietnam War, and that the money being spent on the war should be spent instead on helping the poor. And as we've seen also in Canada, he was passionate in bringing light to the injustices inflicted on First Nations people. He intervened on one occasion on their behalf when attempts were being made to segregate Indigenous children with light-coloured skin from those with darker skin within the same tribe. In his book, Why Can't We Wait?, he wrote the following: Our nation was born in genocide, but it embraced the doctrine that the original Native American was an inferior race. Even before there were large numbers of African Americans on our shores, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. From the 16th century forward, blood flowed in battles over racial supremacy in America. We are perhaps the only nation which has tried as a matter of national policy to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. Indeed, even today, we have not permitted ourselves to reject or feel remorse for this shameful episode. Instead, our literature, our movies, our drama, and our folklore all exalt it. And I'm reminded of all of those cowboy movies I watched as a child and think of the negative influence that probably had on myself. King's last sermon was delivered at Ebenezer Baptist Church, and it was recorded and played at his funeral. In that sermon, King made a request that at his funeral, no mention of his awards or his honours be made, but that it be said he tried to follow Jesus, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, and to love and serve humanity. Through his love of neighbour and non-violent activism, he stayed true to the golden rule: to do to others as you would have them do to you. Highlighted by the mourners at his funeral, singing his favourite hymn, "Take my hand, precious Lord. Take my hand." His death was not in vain, for it was his assassination that finally brought about the enactment of the US Civil Rights Act of 1968. His life of resistance against racial prejudice and discrimination was a life well lived. Well done, good and faithful servant. Amen.